Hello, I'm John Butler, Investment Director at Fortune and Freedom. Today I'm joined by my colleague Nick Hubble to discuss some fascinating and perhaps disconcerting developments under the waves. This week, two subsea cables in the Baltic Sea were damaged. No one knows by whom or why necessarily, but there's a lot of speculation going on. Nick, I believe you think this is part of a bigger story and not just some isolated random event or two isolated random events, as it were. Could you elaborate, please?
Yeah, this has been going on for many months or even years now. Suspicious amounts of subsea and submarine cables are getting severed, going missing, being cut, being sabotaged. And the interesting thing about this is that whoever's doing it seems to be getting away with it quite consistently. Every now and then, a ship that is suspected of having done this, usually from Russia or from China, gets chased by the Navy for a while, but nothing ever seems to come of it. And the damage just keeps on accumulating and piling up. And this is starting to become sort of an undeniable sequence of events that are somehow connected. We've got even the financial media now jumping onto this trend. Bloomberg had a short documentary, about a 15-minute video, asking whether Russia is raging a subsea war or a war under the sea already. And so I wanted to investigate this in the recent issue of the Fleet Street letter, because I think it all leads to a lot of investment implications as well. Recently, this has escalated so much that you and I and several of the other editors at Southbank Investment Research and also at our affiliates all around the world are actually getting quite worried about whether this is a signal of war escalating in Europe.
Well, certainly there's a long history here of cables being snipped, in some cases prior to the formal outbreak of hostilities. I believe in World War I, even before some of the first shots were fired on land, there were maneuverings taking place under the waves to potentially compromise the so-called three C's of the belligerents: communications, command, and control. And perhaps there's some of that going on. I mean, is that possible?
Yeah, so it's become a mainstream sort of topic to accuse the Russians of doing this on purpose. So I think Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, who's possibly going to be a leader in an upcoming election, so potential German chancellor, he's openly accusing the Russians of doing this. It tends to be a Chinese registered vessel that is the most likely culprit each time this occurs. The various governments and intelligence services go through this weird cycle of accusing Russia, then deciding actually it was this Chinese vessel, and then going back to the Russians, because it's obviously more politically correct at the moment in Europe to accuse Russia of doing these sorts of things. As you say, this tends to preclude some sort of military attack. These are mostly communications cables, internet cables that are being severed. One of them is, related to the NATO operations, but the point being that people are getting away with doing this without any consequences, which is the fascinating part, right? If we knew who was doing this and there was some sort of geopolitical consequences, it would sort of make sense and be quite clear. What's not clear is why it keeps happening without the corresponding consequences.
But it's also not just the three C's, that is command, control, communications, and the military implications. We also had the Nord Stream blow up, which there's never been anything definitive concluded by any government, notwithstanding multiple investigations. So we're also talking energy infrastructure beneath the waves potentially being compromised, right?
Yeah, and that was the story we focused on in the Fleet Street letter, is if whoever it is able to sabotage subsea cables with such impunity, and they're able to do it with energy infrastructure as well, then what does this mean for all these energy projects that are so reliant on subsea cables, right? So we have the whole net zero scheme reliant on subsea cables. Offshore wind is reliant on subsea cables to move its electricity. We've got the high voltage direct current connections between places like France, the UK, Ireland, France. The UK actually has the two longest in the world. I believe that the UK is connected to Norway and Denmark. The point being that renewable energy works by means of shifting power around a continent, so that even if it's sunny in one place, not in another, the system still functions overall by moving that power around. And subsea cables are a crucial part of that. But if someone's been cutting cables and getting away with it, that makes the whole renewable energy project start to look like an immense security risk, right? You can't have your energy system reliant on subsea cables that can get cut, with impunity, with geopolitical impunity. So I would argue that the whole renewable energy net zero concept, as it's currently thought of with these subsea cables, is under immense threat here, and that at some point governments are going to start realizing, if they haven't already, that they cannot rely on subsea cables, and therefore they cannot rely on offshore wind and interconnection cables between other countries, and therefore they cannot rely on intermittent energy generally.
Well, it's certainly an issue if you're an island, or if you're, say, one of the Baltic countries that relies on extensive coastline and relative shallow areas, such as the Dogger Bank, for example, as theoretically ideal locations for this sort of renewable energy capacity. Because then, of course, you're highly vulnerable. What appears to be an advantage, having that shoreline, having that wind, becomes a disadvantage. And whereas basically a land power country like Russia wouldn't be at the same sort of disadvantage. They're less reliant. So we are the ones who are vulnerable here, but not only in a military capacity, but in an energy capacity, whereas other countries might not have the same disadvantages.
Yeah, that's disproportionately true for us. But even like a country that has made itself reliant on such subsea connections. So, for example, Germany, right? So they require these interconnectors between Northern Europe to function. So, they need the nuclear power from Sweden and a lot of those Baltic states, even though they don't necessarily need to decide to rely on interconnector cables. They have done so and are doing so. Some of them are woken up. But the point being that, if renewable energy is reliant on the ability to move energy large distances, and that is reliant on subsea cables, then the whole thing starts to fall apart, right? It's sort of, there's just too many dominoes lined up, and all it takes is a Russian to knock over the first one and the whole thing collapses. So it's obviously not a suitable way of achieving energy security. Over the last few years, it's become very popular for governments to claim that the renewable energy system is all about energy security, because we're no longer reliant on Russian gas and Middle Eastern oil and so on and so forth. And my point is that the opposite is also true, that it makes us very exposed and very vulnerable to whoever the actors are in the sea that are constantly finding it very easy to sabotage all these cables.
Well, Europe really has a challenge then, doesn't it? Because as the recent decades have rolled by, all of this undersea infrastructure has been developed. And now it seems a lot of it's being destroyed, which of course means that Europe is less dependent, or can rely less on itself, and becomes even more reliant on external sources of power and energy. Nord Stream's no longer available to bring it from Russia. So now Europe is heavily reliant on liquefied natural gas imports from around the world. And let's face it, an LNG tanker fleet may be on the surface of the waves, but it's also still a potential vulnerability. I mean, there's no easy solution to this, is there?
Well, I think there's a big difference between sinking a ship or threatening to sink one. So we have the Houthis demonstrating that, but we kind of know who's doing what on the surface. What fascinates me about the subsea cable story is that there's no accountability for whoever is doing it. There's some.
But why not? Why not? Why are we having all these investigations and no one ever concludes anything? Russia's always the suspect, but where's the evidence? Where's the proof? Why keep it all under wraps?
Yeah, that's what was fascinating in the Bloomberg story that quoted the German defense minister. His quote accusing the Russians was followed that no evidence has been provided of Russia being involved in this. There's a couple of theories as to why. One of them is that these subsea cables are so heavily rigged with acoustic listening devices for Russian submarines that they're almost a valid target, right? You can't blame them, and so the incentive is to keep this under wraps and engage in this clandestine submarine cable war. But also, it just highlights just how vulnerable we are right now if it's acknowledged, right? The story becomes so obvious if, someone's been cutting cables for years and we haven't done anything about it. It's very embarrassing and humiliating. Also, I think governments are realizing what's going on. So, for example, we recently had the Swedish government reject, I think it was 13 offshore wind farms because of how close they were going to be to Russia and how vulnerable they would be to Russian interference in a conflict. Would make it just too easy for Russia to disrupt Swedish energy supplies. So I think governments are waking up and they're trying to reverse and fix these sorts of things. And they're starting to realize they can't become too reliant. And it explains a lot of the nuclear story as well recently. So you want to fix the problem before you acknowledge it if you're a politician. So maybe politicians are waking up to the risk and are countering it already. And maybe that's why this activity is sort of accelerating. The Russians are sort of getting in there at the last gasp before Western Europe politicians wake up and start to fix these problems. But that's a very optimistic interpretation of facts.
Well, it's really difficult to know what's going on. I recall how during the Cold War, there were occasional incidents, underwater incidents, and the news of what really happened in some cases only trickled out years later. And in fact, one of those incidents did have to do with Sweden. Sweden, as a neutral country during the Cold War, had to protect itself from all sides. And they had this extensive network of sonar nets, that is nets they would actually drop down in some critical waterways. And the nets would be able to detect subs coming and going. And if a sub got too close, it could actually get caught in the net. Apparently that happened once. And immediately there were all these stories that went out that it was a Russian sub. And yet years later, it comes out that, in fact, it appears it was an American submarine. So it's very, very difficult to know. And certainly neither you nor I are in a position to do so. But we can, of course, see the implication here. And investors can see the implications here, that this infrastructure is not safe. That's not just a military issue. It's also an energy security issue. And that may be the big takeaway here for investors, right?
Yeah, that story sounds like the Nord Stream 2 story, right? The sabotage of the two Nord Stream pipelines, where there's all these competing narratives of what actually happened. But yeah, I think the big takeaway here is that especially offshore wind is just too vulnerable, and perhaps just intermittent energy more generally because of its reliance on the interconnected cables between different countries, or even within a country, from Scotland to southeast England. They're just too vulnerable for this whole thing to be viable on an energy security level. And the Russians have been busy demonstrating this, or the Chinese. And it's going to require a complete rethink of net zero and the energy transition and so on and so forth. And I think, for many years now, I've been trying to figure out how politicians row back, or what's the phrase I'm looking for, reverse their mind, their opinions on net zero in a way that is sort of considered to be politically acceptable, right? Because they've been telling us for many years we need to have renewable energy in order to save the planet. How are they possibly going to row this back? And the only way I can think of so far is this energy security issue. They can quite plausibly say to their populations, look, something more important than saving the planet by cutting carbon emissions has popped up, and it's energy security. We cannot rely on subsea cables. All these forms of energy rely on subsea cables functioning. Therefore, we need something better and new. Nuclear, gas, all these other solutions start to pop up that are already emerging and becoming a big thing. And so investors, I think, need to transition even more so than they already should have away from intermittent renewables, especially the ones that are reliant on subsea cables, which means offshore wind, and towards the energy systems that they think will replace that. In my opinion, that's going to be SMRs, but that's a whole other story.
Right. Nuclear, small modular reactors. And in fact, it's interesting how these two topics are linked, because several years ago, there was a very, very clear pivot by a large number of European politicians in particular, who changed their tune from having demonized nuclear power as excessively dangerous and not necessary to re-embracing it because it's essentially zero carbon power. Even green parties in Europe that practically originated as anti-nuclear power, anti-nuclear weapon parties started embracing nuclear power big time a few years ago. I noticed that big pivot in the papers, in particular the German press. I read the German papers now and again, having lived there for years and having become familiar with that. So here we go again. You know, as you say, it's a bit of deja vu. We've got a fresh excuse for perhaps weaning countries away from excessive reliance on some of these supposedly green and renewable technologies. Now it's the clear and present danger and threat to energy security.
Yeah, and what's ironic about that story with the Greens and the anti-nuclear movement, especially in Germany, as you say, is, you know, it's sort of anti-scientific, right? They're just scientifically wrong about how dangerous nuclear power is, so that they haven't got a good track record by that measure.
No, I suppose not. Well, look, it's a fascinating topic in all aspects. So we can't see what's happening under the waves, but there are things going on that should be concerning and should be of interest to investors. And so I think it's great that you picked up on this topic months ago. You've been all over it. I've learned a lot from some of the discussions that we've had, and I look forward to having more. Thanks for joining us today, Nick. Fascinating as always, and I'm sure we'll discuss this topic again soon.